So where we left on Friday, we were talking about localization. We had watched this video. I'd kind of thrown the table up on the board. We hadn't had a chance to actually finish it out though. So just to kind of summarize what we talked about, remember on Thursday we kind of talked about why we want to do this, why we want to do this localization, why we want to do these translations. I showed you the video about different things that come up and things we have to solve, and we're working with that, and it's more than just, hey, change this text to this other language. There's a lot of other things that happen. I showed you how to use the translation editor to kind of start putting in the Spanish strings. We did that with Google Translate. And so we kind of got that process started. Where I left off is we were working with the view models, and I kind of got on a bunny trail. I pushed up the finished version of that, but then I pushed up also a refactored version, because at the end of the day I kind of found out maybe that was maybe a wrong path to go down to, so I've kind of rolled that back to what it was. So you can look at that in the movie list example if you haven't seen it yet. You know, that's kind of where I ended up just using integers and not worrying about those classes that I'd kind of tried to create. So what we want to talk about today is the second half of that. On the lab, I've actually broken it up into 2 iterations. So there's 20 points for the part that we talked on Thursday, and there's 10 points for the part that I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So I want to talk about a few different things here in terms of locale, format strings, number format, date format, and then we can talk a little bit about the server side of things as well. Although that's not per se, I'm not so focused on this as much as the other parts today. Okay. Let's start looking at some of the classes. So in Java, actually, this is a class that originated in Java. It's from java.util. So it's actually been in the Java JDK for a really long time. Okay, but it's also here. We can use it on Android as well. Okay. The locale is the central part in any Java app that really determines how things get output, how they get formatted, dates and numbers and various things like that. So it's actually a really important class to kind of understand if you're doing anything with Java. Okay. By default, most things that you use, if there is something that uses the locale, it will by default use the user's, as it say, default locale. So in the way you get the default locale is you just say locale.getDefault. So that way you can get whatever their default locale is. That changes based on their device settings. So if you're writing for Android, that's based on the place we showed you in the app, in Android, in the systems, to go change the locale. And it would be your top locale is what it would be set to. If you're doing this on Windows, then it's also, you can also change, locales there. Or if you're talking about, Java that's running on the server, you can also change locales there, and it'd be based on the operating system specific setting. Cool. So locale get default always gives you a value based on what the operating system is set to. There's a bunch of places in the APIs where it will give you warnings about that, where it's like, hey, you are using the default locale. Are you sure you want to do that? And so sometimes, oftentimes that's a place where you need to be explicit. Do I want to use this locale, or do I want to use the default locale? So some cases we might say, hey, let's just use the default locale because I want it to be in the user's locale. Or I might say locale US if it's something I'm trying to put into the database or send to a server, etc. if I want it to always be in a certain localization, which oftentimes is what we do on the back end, and we do get default on the front end. Okay? So this class is pretty important in the central area of working with localization and code, and you'll see it pop up in a few different places in UI. Okay. In terms of what this encompasses, it's a lot more than just language. So you can see there's language, there's script, there's country codes. There are different variants that you can find, extensions, etc. So locale is a lot of things put together. But the simplest version is it's usually just a language plus a country. Like ENUS would be our locale. Or ESME, I believe, is Spanish Mexico. Or you have JA if you're doing Japanese in Japan, right? So it's oftentimes both of those two things put together. So that's one thing to understand first of all there. There are different constructors for the locale. We basically never use those constructors as one big heads up. We're generally going to use those in one of two places. You're either going to say, they've got kind of a lookup. I'm going to just go down to the APIs that we're interested in. There are, first of all, there's a bunch of constants here where you can get specific countries. Like, so if I want to get Canada, Chinese, etc., English, US, all of these are available here, so we can get those as constants, and those all return a locale. So for a lot of the common countries, you can just get them as a constant. Also in here, the other method that we look at is there's a static method called getDefault, which is down here. So that will give you the current. So in terms of the API, that's usually as far as we go. Either locale.getDefault or locale.getUS. Cool? You can, if you have a specific name in mind, then you can, let's see, where is it? It's a static method for language tag. So you can also do it from a string if you have a string version of it as well. But it's usually just going to be one of the other two things. Okay, so that's number one, is just to mention that's there, and that's what that means, right? That's a combination of English, or sorry, your language and your country, and that tells how several of these things work. So specifically, the three things I want to talk about: the formatter, the number formatter, and the date format. All of those are based on what locale you're on. Depending on the locale you choose, will change how those classes behave. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look at the formatter. Java.util.formatter. So the formatter class was introduced in Java 5, and it's been with Android since the beginning. Okay. It draws its origin, as I've said before, from printf in the C world. Okay. This is a really, really good place to look because it'll explain a few things. Okay. In this formatter class, in the overview, you'll find out how, first of all, how to use string.format is oftentimes one way that you use this. So, for instance, if I say, let me actually do this on Notepad. So, for instance, if I say something like, pop up a new tab here and switch my language into Java. So let's say, for instance, if I want to say I've got some sort of price, string price formatted. When I can do the formatting is I can say string.format. Okay. Now the first argument to string.format is always your format string. It's a special string that it treats different ways. So remember here, if I wanted to do something like this, I could do something like put a $sign in. I might need to escape it, and %.2f, and then I'm going to put in here my price. And so maybe I need to define my price. Double price is equal to $3.50, right? So if I've got something like this, that's going to try and take my number that I have and turn it into a string based on what I provided, right? So the first place that it finds like a %f or %s or %d is going to replace in whatever argument you put in there, right? And if I wanted to put two things in there, say maybe I want to put a name and a price. So maybe I do %s here, and that would be something like name, price, string, name is Bob. right, I could do something like that. And that's quite helpful, right? We use that those kinds of format strings quite a bit. Okay, but that's the basic understanding, right? So you start with the format string, you pass in whatever arguments or placeholders you want to put in. Okay. You can see how this might be helpful, right? It's pretty short. The other thing is that it factors in to translations. Okay. So because we can also put these types of format strings into our resources, which I've done at least one of those in the project, but there are other places where you may want to do this. Everybody with me there? Okay. So this is one way I can do the formatting. Okay. Typically speaking, you're going to get a warning about this because if you're doing this in the Android Studio, or in IntelliJ, both of those are going to give you a warning about string format. They're going to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Because you haven't specified the locale, right? So a common misperception is if I write it this way, that everything will always be formatted the same way in every culture. That's actually not guaranteed, okay? So remember, one of the things that we talked about on Thursday was that in Europe, they have different separators, right? We use the comma for the thousand separator, we use the dot or the period for the decimal point, right? Right here, I'm saying this %.2f is saying formatted out as 2 decimal points, as 2 decimal places, okay? So if I'm doing that in English, that's going to put it out with a dot. If I'm doing this in most European locales, it's going to come out with a comma instead, where that period would be. So this output does change a bit depending on what culture you're working with. Does that make sense to everybody? That's one of the things you have to watch out for, okay? The reason that's important is if I then take that and put that into a database somewhere, I don't want that to go into the database as $350 instead of $3.50, right? Because that comma and that period get misunderstood, okay? So the way you resolve the warning that you're going to see in Android Studio anytime you're doing that, there's one of two ways you can do that. I can say locale.us, right? And this would give me what it would be in America, right? That's going to ensure that we're always running with the period, and that's really good if I want to put that into a database. On the other hand, sometimes I may want it to be culturally sensitive, so I may want it to be different based on the locale. I might do something like this, right? So this way is going to ensure that it's always as a period. This way it's going to be dependent on the user's culture. Does that make sense? You have to kind of pick and choose what you're doing. It's based on if you're showing it to the user, if this is going to be on screen, you probably want to do this. If it's going to be something that we're pushing to the database, then we're going to do the other, right? We're going to make sure that it's in US as far as it's formatted. Does that make sense for everybody right now? Okay. So that's one of the things that we have to watch out for. Okay. Now, when we put these into Android and we work with this, oftentimes what you're going to see is it's going to look more like this. We would say, hey, I want a get string, and specifically that's on a context. And so it might look something more like this. Context.getString, I would refer to r.string, and maybe I would say this like the name, price, format of something like that. And so it would look more like this, oftentimes in Android. Rather than using the string format, oftentimes it will look like this. Now, if you're showing it to the user, if you're having any sort of string that's user visible, I would generally recommend taking this third approach, right? Generally take this third approach because this is also going to pull the format string from your translations, whereas this one I've hard-coded in the name and the price, right? Those aren't translated. Those words, name and price, are not translated in the middle one. The format for the price is changing, but not the other parts of the string. That make sense? So this is generally the way that we're going to do anything that is user visible. It's important to understand the middle one because the string that we have here, that's the string that's going to be in that resource. Cool? And then this would be for database, right, is where we would use that. Okay. Just a reminder again, if we're looking at things like %d is an integer, %f is a floating point number, and that would be, specifically, that would be double or float. If we're talking about integers, that's integer, that's long, that's integer, that is long, integer, short, byte. All of those would be considered %d. Double and float would be considered %f. Okay? One common perception is to just, a common mistake that people do is they'll just look at the first letter of the type and say, oh, well, that's the format specifier, and it's not that simple. It's D is integer or F is floating point number. So it's not directly corresponding to the first letter of the type that you're working with. Another one, %s is string, and that can actually be anything that's a char sequence. We've got %t, which is date and time. So that can be a date object, that can be a calendar, or it can be a local date time. Any of those three APIs are supported with the %t specifier. Okay. Now, part of why I wanted to look at the class overview is it actually goes a little bit deeper in there. So for instance, I've kind of showed you the .to thing, but if you look further through the instructions, there is an example here. Okay, so there's a few formats. Okay, here's the simple format. The full format looks like this. In terms of placeholders that you're putting in, it's a %sign, and then flags, a width, and a conversion. Flags, a width, and a conversion. Okay. So I just talked about the %d, the d, the f, the t, and the s. Those are the conversion. Those are the type. Okay. The flags tell it how to behave. Okay. And so a flag character can basically be there or not there. So it's determined based on the presence or absence of that flag character. For the width, that determines how wide you want the string to be. Okay, so for instance, I could say a width of 5 characters or a width of 7 characters, and that way it will pad whatever string, whatever thing I give to it with extra spaces or extra zeros. Okay, so the format specifiers are a little bit more broad. There's some more things you can do. So let's talk about, in general, if I'm going to do some things with strings. If I've got things with strings, let's say I have something like this. Let's say I do %7s. Okay, that's going to say that I want a string that's left, that is padded up to 7 characters. So if it's not 7 characters long, then it will add in additional spaces. So that means that something like Bob is going to get turned into Bob with 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it would look like that. Okay. So I can pad it. I can also pad it. That's one way to pad it. I can also pad it on the other side. So one of the flags I can add in is the minus sign. And so if I say -7, then it would be padded at the beginning instead of padded at the end. Okay. So that's another thing to kind of be aware of. You know, if you're trying to do some alignment, that can be helpful. Now, it's worth mentioning that these alignments usually don't work very well if you're doing anything other than a monospaced font. If you're in Courier New or any of these other fonts that we usually code in, it's great. But if you're using Arial or and any of the normal Android fonts, this usually doesn't give you very good alignment, but it's an option there. Okay? It's more relevant with numbers. So, for instance, if I do the same thing with a number, and I say, let's do 5D, and I take the number 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, then that would get turned into what it would be. It would be 1, 2, 3, and I think I might have the spaces. I think the spaces are on the other end. I think they're right. So 2 spaces. 2. So I can do that, and I can do the same thing with the negative sign and flip it around and say, hey, I want the padding on the right or the left instead. 1, 2. So I can do padding that way. Okay. So that's one of those things you want to be aware of. Is first of all, you can do padding. The other more common thing that happens here is if I do something just slightly, ever so slightly different, there's another helpful flag, 0. So if I 0, 5D, that would take 1, 2, 3 and turn it into 0, 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I apply a 0 at the beginning, that's going to give us that. Desktop. Say that because I keep hitting Control S. Right. So the padding is helpful. Okay. That's one thing to mention that's in there. Okay. You can also combine that with the point and specify some things like this. So for instance, I can get really fancy and say, maybe I want to do 0, 5.2D or 0.2F and take the 3.5, and that would transfer over to, well, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 3.50. Right, so I can do some more formatting like this if I need to pad things with zeros and also have decimal places. So that's one of those things to be kind of aware of. The suggestion that they have isn't in that sense fully complete because the 0.2 is kind of like not covered in that, right? The 5 here is the width and the 0 is a flag. But the 0.2F is kind of also a width and a flag as well. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So those are just some things to be aware of, that there's other formatters, other formats that you can do to get more fancy with your numbers as well. The other thing that oftentimes happens is in the examples above, remember I was doing name and price, right? Well, what happens if I want to, for instance, maybe based on different translations, I might need to flip some things around and say, hey, I'm going to pass the price first and the name. Okay, so if I do this, this is going to cause an error. this is going to throw an exception. Because when it goes through this, it's going to take the price, it's going to try to shove it in as %s, this name, and it's saying I can't do that because a float is not, or a double is not a string. And it won't even get to the second one, but the second one would also complain because a string is not a float, right? The types don't match, right? So, but I may sometimes need to do this where the order of the fields switches based on the particular language that I'm working with. Does that make sense to everybody? Sometimes they're not always going to be in the same order in every language. Okay. So the way that we solve that is we just add a little bit of extra to it. By using the dollar to specify what particular parameters we want. So in this case, the name is the second parameter. So it would be $2, and this is the first parameter, so it would be $1. Okay. And so this is actually why I needed to put $2 here, is because a $ is treated specially. And so the way to escape that is you just put 2 of the things. Or if you need to escape a %, you just put 2% signs. Oftentimes that happens if you're doing like, hey, I want output 50% or whatever. Okay? So that's how you escape. You just put $2 signs or 2 percentages. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So oftentimes if I'm doing these format strings, in general, if I'm doing translations, I will usually go ahead and put the $1, $2, etc. in there if there's more than one token that I'm putting in. I usually don't worry about it too much if there's only one thing, say just the price or just the name. That's also a good reason to maybe, if you've got format strings that have more than one thing placeholder you're putting in there, you might actually want to break that up into separate string resources. Make sense? And because that's going to keep it, in the end, potentially simpler. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the things that you need to know in terms of formatting. And again, I would really, really recommend, there's a lot of information on this class header. You can see that it's pretty tall. The class actually doesn't start until all the way down. Let's see if I can get all the way there. There. Okay. So if you look at my scroll bar, right, I'm 3/4 of the way down and I've finally found the constructor. There is a lot of information at the top of this class. And there are some things like this that you can only find in the API docs that are not actually, there's not actually a guide for them. The guide is here in the top of the class. Okay? So I really, really recommend getting familiar with that if you want to do anything more with Java, because this is something we use all the time, all the time, to do all sorts of things. Okay? But that's just the quick rundown to give you the things you need to know for the assignment I'm asking you to do. Cool? Okay. So that's number one, to give you that kind of orientation around there. Next up. So we've talked a little bit about the formatting, right? I mentioned real quick that this ties in with string resources. Let me jump over to that page and we can kind of talk through this. Okay? So we've been using string resources. We used them on Thursday. We've been using them all semester long, right? But maybe we need to learn a little bit more with them. Okay? So there's a page actually in the docs for every different kind of resources. We're going to be talking about strings today. Tomorrow I'll talk about dimensions and dimensions, and I'll be talking about integers. And then in another week or two, I'll be talking about styles and themes and colors. So there's more things in here we want to talk about as well. But today I'm just going to focus on strings. Okay. Now inside of here, notice that there's actually a few different kinds of strings. There's a string array, and there's also quantity strings or plurals. And there's actually 3 kinds of string resources. Okay. The main one, again, we've used is strings. I think at some point I showed with the spinner how you could utilize that string array as well. Although we ended up falling back to just using strings because it made more sense for what we were doing. And I think for a lot of cases, it will make more sense to use strings over string arrays. Plurals in there, I kind of mentioned when we watched the video, remember how we talked about different languages have different rules about plurals? So like maybe 1 and 0, 1 and 2 have special rules. You may have special rules based on the ending number, digit, etc., things like this. That gives you support to do this. Okay, so I do want to look at that briefly, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much because it's not the main thing I'm asking for you. So all of these are going to go into res values, and so typically this is going to be res value strings, right? It's typically where you're going to see these. In fact, some people will do these in separate files, so you might see the res values strings and a res value string arrays and a res values plurals. Okay, I tend to usually combine those into one file, but you can break those up. Plurals is one of those that can be helpful to have that in a separate file. Okay, so those can be broken up. The file name is not as strict as some other places. In the Java, we refer to that as r.string, the name of the key, and in the XML code, it's @string, the name of the key. Okay. In terms of what goes in there, let's talk about that. So we've seen all of that. We've seen those things. Also here, they notice that there's two calls. There's a get string and a get text. The difference there lies if you're using formatting in there. So for instance, if I want to use bold tags or italic tags, etc., if I want to keep that formatting, then I actually want to call get text. But if I want it to be unformatted, there's no formatting in there, then you're going to call get string. So depending on whether or not there is formatting, HTML formatting in there, that will determine which of those two methods you call. Cool? There's also a get string array as well as a get text array for the same kind of reason. So talking about string arrays, let's jump down to quantities. So there's a good explanation here of why these quantities are and some of the special cases that we encounter more than what we saw in the video. So if you want to get deeper into that, you can take a look at that. But let me just show you a quick summary of what this is going to look like. So kind of like we've done string tags, we've got now a plural tag of plurals. And so within that plurals, you say, here's the name of that plural. So let's say I've got something like games, right? What might this look like? So in my XML, pop up a new one, I'd say plurals, and I'd say game, or name, pull that back from here. Yep, name. I might say, hey, my plural is game. / plurals. And for English, this is pretty simple, right? So I might say item. See if I can pull in an example here. I think they have one. So I want to say quantity. And I believe that there is a default. So things we can do. We can do things like this. Try to get the right thing in here. So item, quantity, copy that so I don't misspell it. So let's say I'm talking about one game. Typically that would be like game. And I might need to specify this as being camel case there, just to be clear on which one this is. So for English it might be, hey, that's one, and for everything else it's games. So typically for English, it's usually that simple. We just say, hey, one is the singular and other is everything else. If you want to be more granular and you care about what happens in the zero case, you can specify, and I think I've got that wrong. I think this should be one spelled out and zero here. I can spell that out as well, but typically we're going to do the, typically we do plural in English there. Okay? So you can set this up for different languages, right? So just like we had a strings XML that was for English and a strings XML is for Spanish, I can do the same sort of thing for English and Spanish, right? So anywhere in your code where you have things that are singular or plural, typically you'd want to create a file like this that contains those plurals. And you know, I kind of talked about the capitalization side. You might even find yourself needing to do something of the sort where it's like lowercase. Of course, this you can potentially handle in code. You just have to be aware of, hey, uppercase may not have, to upper may not behave the way you think it does in other languages, right? So depending on what languages you're supporting and things like that, you may find yourself needing to create two variants of that, one that starts with uppercase and one that doesn't, or you might be able to get away with just one. Cool? Does that make sense for everybody? So that's kind of your starting point, right? As we say, hey, here's the plurals, okay? Now, how does that factor back in to the code, right? Because remember, a lot of times when we're using these things, we're needing to then use some of these format strings that we talked about. And I'm going to call this plurals. Oop. I'm going to save this plurals.xml. Save this as all file types. So my setup in the XML might look like that. When I actually use it, they've got an example here, and they're talking about songs. So here we might say, get the number of songs available, which they're getting as a count. We're asking for resources. And then for resources, they're saying, get quantity string. So get quantity string is this new method where we say, here's the plural that I want, right? So r.plurals.rResource. And then I need to specify what's going to go into there as the number, okay? Now, the reason that they have count twice is because they're first using the count as the input to determine which quantity to use, which are the strings above to use, which are those three Polish strings. And then the second count is being passed as a format argument to put in where they've got that %d. Okay. You can set up these things up this way. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing what they've done here because that leads you into creating a lot more copies of these plurals. Whereas I might want to just take the word that can be pluralized and make that its own resource, right? Rather than pluralizing the whole message, I might want to pluralize just the word. Does that make sense? So what would make this look like in my case? So in my case, if I'm talking about games, I've created these two resources. So I could say something like resources res equals get resources. And it's worth noting that this is generally on a context. So context get resources. And then string game plural would be something like this. I would say res dot get quantity string. I left. Get quantity string. And I'd specify r.plurals.game, and I need to specify maybe the count. All right, so maybe that count, I'll define that up here. Int game count is 5. And so I'd feed that in here, and it would give me the appropriate count. So maybe I want to say, hey, there's this number of search results, right? There's this many games in the list. You know, I might need to say that plural or singular based on what the number comes back as. Now, notice that this is going to come back as either game or games. It's not going to come back as the entire message. So oftentimes I might want to say, hey, I want this actually to be a string that I can show to the message, right? So this might be message is res get string, and I then say r dot string dot game count, and so I might pass in game count. So oftentimes we'll need to do this in 2 stages, right? So stage 1 would be that I say, hey, let's figure out the plural. And then from there, I would say, let's get the actual string. And so this one would be game count. And this would be search results, and I might say, actually I need to put this in here. It's another argument, %d, %s. So oftentimes this is what it's going to look like when you're doing plurals. I'm putting in the number and the plural, right, game or games, and so I need to pass both of those things into the call to get string. Does that make sense to everybody? Oftentimes this is what it looks like when you're trying to translate those plurals appropriately. Cool. This is a thing to kind of keep in mind. So oftentimes we won't do things like say, hey, if it's in the code, we won't want to necessarily put an if statement and say, hey, do this if it's 1, do this if it's 2, do this if it's 0, etc., which you might be familiar with other languages doing this. We want to use this system for translations because then it's going to do the appropriate rules for whatever language you're actually working with. Does that make sense? Because not every language is as simple as English, where it's just 1 and everything else. Make sense? Any questions on that plural system? Okay. So that's how we would set up and work with plurals, is that system. And it's really handy that the Android has that built in, because it means you don't have to implement that. Because normally in most other technologies, I would need to implement all of that logic myself. So that's helpful. Okay. So we talked about that. Another thing I want to talk about real briefly is how does this figure in with string builders? Okay. So when I'm talking about string builders, let's say I want to use a string builder and build the same kind of string that we had talked about here. So let me start with this. So one way you might start this out is I'm trying to get to this string. Let me just comment this out so I have it here. String builder. SB. And if I say new string builder, so get me an empty string. An obvious sort of approach to this might be just to start breaking it up. So I might say sb.append, and I'd say, well, let's start with the first thing, name colon space, and then sb.append, the name, sb.append. I've got an extra D up here, append, and the next part would be here, comma, price, question mark, sb.append, price. And actually I need the dollar sign in here, okay? So one way, if you've been using and working with the string builder, I've seen this in a few cases, is people kind of building strings up this way. Does everybody see that? Okay. If I start this way, there's a few problems here in terms of translations. Okay? What are the problems that you see? Remember, I just to be clear, I prefer to do it the other way, right? To use these format strings. What are some of the issues that you're going to run into if you're doing it this way? In terms of translations or in terms of localization? Because I see at least 3 problems here, right?
Well, like you say, like some languages read from right to left as opposed to
Right to left,
right.
yep. So that's one thing you have to watch out for, because there is kind of a baked-in assumption of left to right, where you're assuming the label is going to come before the name, right? The label before the value. I couldn't say here, name is my name, and blah is the price, right? I'm limited on how I can translate it because this is hard-coded in the order of those things. Is everybody tracking with me there? So for instance, one of the things I can't do is say, hey, let's swap the name and the price, or I can't swap the labels before or after the placeholder values, okay? So one thing is the order. The order is really strictly baked in, okay? That's okay if I'm talking about different lines, right? So line A, B, C, and D, those are still going to be in that same order regardless of what language you go in. So let's say I'm looping over a list of items, I'm writing out one line per thing. That's okay. That's okay to do append there, but not if you're working within the same line or within the same thing. Does that make sense? Is there another issue here? How's the price going to be written out as?
Presuming the money signs always going to be in front of it.
So,
Some language, I don't know if there's some languages where maybe the money signs go after, or I don't know.
so I couldn't do, for instance, USD, which is more common in other countries, is to write this as maybe $3.50 USD instead of putting a dollar sign. Partially because there's a few different countries that actually have dollars. So you have to specify that it's American dollars sometimes. We don't usually see that too often here. How is it going to format 3.5? If I feed in here 3.5, it's actually one of 2 things that will happen. It's going to write it out either as 3.5, which is what you would expect, or it might write it out this way. Because there's rounding error anytime you do formatting. Anytime you take a floating point number and go to a string, you can always get rounding error. And I've told it how many decimal places to use, right? So if there's any rounding error in the number, it's going to write it out like this. You could also write it out as a little bit smaller. So it might be 3.49999. All of those are possible if I just write out quote unquote 3.5. suffice to say, because we store binary numbers in base 2, they don't always convert well back to decimal. Okay, and so you're going to get some of these cases where you don't expect them to happen. So I basically never want to do this because I never want to see this appear to the user. Right? I never want to display that to the user. And I also never even want the first case, which is 3.5. It's also worth mentioning if I pass in a whole number, say $3, it's going to pass it in as 3 if there's no rounding error, right? If there's still not 0.00001 or 2.999999, right? So this is something you really want to avoid. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't want to have this kind of variability when I'm trying to print out a price. Make sense? Okay. So how do I get it forced? How do I take this and get it to force it to be exactly 2 decimal places? How can I change what I'm doing here with the string builder to force it to have 2 decimal places instead of a variable number? Aaron. So what?
It's no ideas coming to mind.
There's 2 ways to do it. One way that I've already given you. Zach. Point 2. But where? I can, but how? Let me toss something out there. What will that give me? What would this bit of code produce? Say my name is Bob and I've got 3.5 as my price. Is that going to format it the way I want it to? Yay or nay? So show of hands that say it's going to work. It's going to format it correctly. Okay, so for everybody who thinks it's not going to work, how is it not going to work? What is it going to do instead?
You don't have the string dot format.
You know what?
You don't have the string dot format.
I don't have any string out format there, so it's just going to write it out as .2f. It's not going to treat it as a format string, right? So in order for this to function, I need to effectively nest it. So I need to say like string.format percent dot .2f, right? So if I want to format the price, I need to embed the string format here. Okay. If I remember right with the API, another way that you can do this, if I remember correctly, there is an append format function, and I may be misremembering this, but I believe you can also do this as well. You can say append format, or you can say append and nest the format. Either of those 2 things work. Cool. So either of those can function as a way that you can solve the problem. So what I'm kind of leading into there is, let's say I want to actually translate the entire thing, right? I still may have a reason to keep the string builder, but maybe I want to use a string resource, okay? So if I want to do this using string resources, instead of hard coding in all these pieces, how can I still do that with the string builder? So one of the things to remember, I can't use string.format because it's coming from a string resource. String format doesn't know how to take a resource ID. Append format also doesn't work because that assumes that you have the format string in code, which we don't, right? The format string is in a resource. Chase?
Not sure.
How did I bring it in from a resource to begin with? What function did I use?
History.
Use getString, right? So I still need to use getString here, even if I'm using it with the string builder, right? So if I'm trying to properly translate these things, the correct way to do this would be sb.append, call getString in here, so like context.getString, and it would look like r.string. And I think I called it, let me just pull it in from up here, it'd be that. Right, so if I want to use a string builder and do translations, this is what you're going to need to change it up to. It shouldn't look like this, it should look like this. Does that make sense to everybody? You understand why I say that? Okay. Now, one question, one thing to also point out here, if I want to, say, maybe add a new line after that, I would recommend not putting that into the string, into the format string. If you're trying to do new lines, I would recommend just putting that in with code like so. So, like if I'm trying to add in that, I would add it here at the end and not try to incorporate that into that part into the format string. Because that's going to be the same for every language. That has more to do with the logic of the rest of your code than the actual translation process. So it actually makes the translation process easier if you don't put new lines into those string resources in general. Cool. So that's the way I would recommend incorporating things with string builders. Are there any questions about formatting? Does that kind of make sense, putting all those pieces together? The string format, understanding how that works with resources, and the string builder? Okay. So we talked about that. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is these number format and these date format classes, right? So far, right, I've told you that you can use these format strings, right, to format strings, to put in strings, to put in integers, to put in floating point numbers, etc. Right? Now, the thing to be aware of still is things are very different from culture to culture to culture, right? And that does encompass some of the cultural differences, but often at times it doesn't cover all of the cultural differences, what we've done so far. Okay? So oftentimes I need to do a little bit more from that. Okay? And that's where the number format comes in place. So oftentimes when you want to format a number and you want it to be in the user's culture, it's usually better to use the number format class than those fancy format specifiers. Those fancy format specifiers are great if you're trying to put it into the database or file. If you're trying to have it be in a very particular format, that's great, okay? But if I'm trying to do this with something that I'm going to show to the user, it's not always the easiest way to do it, okay? So if I look at the number format class, there are a few different static functions on here that we can call. Okay? So number format in general is an object that you can give any sort of number. You can give it floating point numbers and you can give it decimals or integers. It'll work with both. And then you can tell it, hey, I want to format. Okay? Now, based on what method you call, what static method you call is going to give you a different kind of formatting. So for instance, if I say get instance, that's just going to give me the normal, hey, I can format any kind of number. It's not going to specify how many decimal places it has. It's still going to do the like 0.0001 or 0.4999999, right? It's still going to have rounding errors, okay? But that will be locale sensitive. You also can specify, notice the locale in the API, you can say get instance and get for a specific locale. So if I know I want to get US or Mexico, Spanish, etc., Chinese, I can get a particular locale dynamically there. Usually I'm just going to call get instance to get user's particular instance. In there, there's some more specific ones. So there's a get integer instance, which I can use if I want to just format out an integer. That will mean that there's no decimal places. So that actually works whether you're passing in a float or you're passing in an integer. It'll actually work with either of those things. It's just, hey, I know I want to output it as an integer, but it doesn't actually matter what number type it is coming in. So there's get integer instance, which is helpful. Let me add some of these notes to here. So number format, get integer instance. That's one option. Another helpful method that's in here, I'll go ahead and close that, is I can also scroll down further. There's a get number instance there. I'm looking at get percent intent instance, right? So this one's specifically designed for formatting percentages. There's one gotcha that you have to be aware with the percent instance is it does expect your numbers be in the range from 0 to 1 and not 0 to 100. That's pretty easy to fix. So we add that one in too, and we can talk about that one. So number format, dot get percent instance. There is a get number instance. There was, what was the other one I'm looking for? I think it's get currency. Yes, get currency is another common one we use as well. So number format, get currency. Okay. So from the number format, we're usually going to use one of these as our starting point. Integer instance, number instance, percentage, let's get currency. Cool. Okay, and they're all designed to format different kinds of numbers. That's the big thing to understand. They're designed to cover different kinds of numbers. Okay. Now, because there's some logic baked into all of these static methods that are based on the locale, I would recommend asking for the ones that you need and then reusing those rather than asking for one for every particular output. Because these are actually not as cheap as you might think that they are because of the locale involvement in the process of what that function has to do. Okay? So that means usually I would do something like this. I might say up at the top, I need my number formats. So I might say integer format. I might say number format, float format. I might say percent format. And I might say currency format. It's pretty often that you'll need more than one of these, so I'd usually try to give them the name of what kind they are rather than just calling them number format. I would really, really stress you do that. So even if it looks like there's only one today, it's very likely that when you come in and make more changes in the future, that you'll find that you need more than one type, okay? So I'd ask for all the types that I need, right? And so then once I go to start outputting numbers, it might look something like this. String integer is integer format. And this might be something like a year, right? 1999 would typically be formatted as an integer. I think actually I need to call dot format on there. Yeah, dot format. And if I need to do a floating point number, string float, we call that INF. This would be my float format. And I might do something like format, let's see, what's the speed of light? This would be a common one. So, speed of light, I think it's like 3.8, 3.08. Yeah, so we'll call it 3 times 10 to the 8, 10 to the 8th, yeah. So this would be like that. And I might have, if I need to have a percentage of some sort, this might be, hey, maybe I take my my tax, multiply it by 0, or divide it by 100 to get it into that range from 0 to 100. If it's not already in, or 0 to 1, if it's not already in that range. And similarly, if I'm working with currency, then I might say like format 3.5. So that's oftentimes what you might see for these different kinds of numbers. So does that make sense, everybody? Hopefully you can see that there's maybe some differences to how we want those outputted, right? I think this one is going to give us back, this number format is going to give us back the string $3.50. This would be, let's say my tax is 7. So 7 divided by 100, this would be 7%. This would be, I need to actually look at what that would be. But I think that might still be in a similar format. And this one would just be 1999. So those different format strings are really important. Okay. This is usually the way that we want to deal with numbers, is using these different kind of number formats. The beauty of doing this is it will go and figure out the appropriate format string for the culture you're in. Does that make sense for everybody? So you don't even have to specify things like 0.2 or different things like that. It will just go ahead and figure those things out for you, right? You don't need to know what's the thousand separator, if it's colons lax, or if it's commas, or etc. It will go and figure all those things out. Same thing with percents, it'll have the percent sign at the end. Okay. Now, one thing to be wary of, what happens if I'm, say, in Germany, my device is in Germany, and I try to output 3.5 as a currency? Huh? So it would look something like, let's say this is in EU. If I try to do the same thing, and go back to my locale, say I do, I think I know what it is. Let's say I do number format. And I specify the currency is locale.de for Germany or Deutsch. And I try to do the same thing. This would give me the euro symbol, which I don't have on hand, but it still would be like 3.50, right? The problem here is that 350 euro is not equal to $350. That's the one that gets weird. Okay, so these number formats in general are great, except the currencies are weird, right? Currencies are weird because you may not actually want it in the local currency, because the local currency and the original currency are not necessarily the same, right? So it'll format it correctly, but it assumes that you've already done the conversion in the value, right? It'll assume that you've already done the conversion in the value. So what I oftentimes need to consider is how do I deal with that, okay? So let's say we're working with eBay data, right? So just to remind you, with the eBay data, remember when you get back the price, it's looking like something like this. When we get back the price, it is a currency. USD, and a value, and let's say this is 3.50. So that's what I've done so far. Okay. So how should I correctly format that price? Given the tools I've given you, right? How should I correctly format that price? So recognize it's telling us what the currency is, telling us US dollars, right? Or it could potentially tell us European, euros, it could be yen, it could be different currencies from there. And we've got the number, the price is already a pre-formatted string, okay? What do I do? What do I want the end result to be to the user? Okay, so let's throw that as an option. So you said $350 USD. Okay, that's one option you said. What's another option of how I could format that out to the user? Do I need both the $ and USD? not really, right? They say the same thing, right? So I could spit it out as 350, $350, or I could spit it out as 350 USD, right? I would prefer one of these two over the ones with both because it just combines kind of too much information, or it's duplicate information because it's telling me the currency twice, right? I really only want to say the currency once. Okay, right? So I prefer to end up with one of these two answers. Okay, what about for my European users? This is okay for my American users. What about my European users? How do I want to output it for them? Symbol around here. And Evan had a question on the chat as far as what was happening here. Will there be a rounding error on this line? And yes, there would be, because I'm dividing two integers. So I'm dividing 7 by 100, that would result in 0, because integer division rounds down. So I can fix that one of two ways. I can say divided by 100.0, or I could do that by saying that this is 7.0. Changing either of those to a double or float will fix the rounding error problem. To answer that. So my options, thinking about euros, right? This is for US. Yep.
Canada, has it happened so much simple for their dollars?
I think it's Canadian dollars.
So there's just no dollar sign?
I believe that they use $sign as well. So like they'll do this, or they would do, I think 350 CAN or something of that sort. There's an acronym for them as well. So if I'm talking about German euro, right? My options, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that kind of format. It could be like so, or it could be, the extra quotes, it could be 3.50 euro. Okay. I kind of want to get this into one of these two formats, potentially. Okay. Now, can I do that? Can I take this and spit it out in that format? And would it be correct? I could do it, it wouldn't be correct. Why?
It's not converted.
Not converted, right? So it's not going to be 3.5 euro. It's going to be a different price. So it's not just about formatting, it's also you have to worry about the currency conversion, right? So let's just say I go online, I ask for the conversion, and I say 3.5 USD to, there it is, EUR, euro. and I get 3.21. So that means that this rate, at least today, and it could change tomorrow, would be 3.21. Or I could do this. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? If I do this approach and try to convert it into euro, then I also have to do the currency conversion, which is going to change from day to day. So the only way to do that is you'd have to have another API, some sort of REST API that you can feed the number into and get back an answer for the day. There's no way that you can hard code in a currency table and say, hey, it's always this. There has to be a server involved because it changes so frequently. In fact, I might not want to do that as a business because it changes so frequently. Because if I'm taking up to the minute currency conversions, maybe I take your order on Monday and then on Friday your currency is worth a different amount. Does that make sense? So actually for a lot of businesses, you don't necessarily want to convert the currency. You just want to say, hey, I'm going to take 350 because I know 350 US dollars will be, in theory, worth the same thing on Monday as it does on Friday. So I don't oftentimes want to present the user with a different currency than what the user is actually selling it in. Does that make sense? So that means if you do find listings, even this happens sometimes on eBay, sometimes you'll find listings from European sellers and you'll sometimes list that. You'll generally list that as, here's the price in euros. Oh, and by the way, that's roughly this much. That's roughly this many US dollars. But we'll list both of those things so that you're aware. Okay? So let's talk about, how do I get to these two formats? Let's say I want to get to 350. Okay? Well, that one's pretty easy. If I want to get to 350, I would just say, hey, let's use our currency format and format as, this would be, maybe I call this item. I could say something like item dot price dot value. Would that work? Would that give me the correct price here? Anybody see the problem? There's a problem here. If I try to write that code, it's going to crash. Not work. Why? Because value is a string, right? If I say number format dot format, it has to start with a number, right? And so that could be float or double or integer. It could be even the uppercase, the boxed version. It could be those objects, but you can't directly take a string. Okay, so this doesn't work. This throws an exception because I'm giving it a string instead. How do I fix that? Double dot. Yeah, or parse double. Parse double. So I need to do another step. So this is I'm going to call this the price formatted. But before I can do that, I need the double price, which would be double dot parse double, and there I would pass in the item price dot value. So this is a case where you'd need to do it in 2 steps because the currency formatter takes a number and not a string. Does that make sense to everybody? That might not happen if you're working from your database, because oftentimes if you're pulling the stuff from your database, you're probably going to store it as a number. But we're pulling it from their REST API, they're giving it to us as a string. Okay? So that's one way I could do it. Is there another way I could get that same format? Could I get there without trying to parse it? Because parsing it can throw an exception. It also can lead to some rounding errors. Because I'm having to go from here, which the string it's in base 10, to when I parse it, now it's in base 2. So it's not guaranteed to be equivalent or lossless. It's not guaranteed that I'm exactly going to get the same price as what was in the string. Does that make sense to everybody? Can I keep it as a string and still produce this $3.50? Cody? What's another way I could use to format this? Danny?
Check if the currency is USD, if it is, use the dollars.
That sounds awesome. Let's do that. So if you're totally right, I could just say here, if item dot price dot currency, remember these are strings, so objects dot equals, and say, hey, currency, if that's US dollars, then yeah, price formatted is equal to $ plus that. Now, I've got a little bit of a thing in that case I have to sort out. So I need to say, hey, let's define it outside the if statement so it's available later. But what do I do in the else case? What if it's not US dollars?
Create it as the value and then the currency.
And then you said the currency?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds great. So I could say, if it's US dollars, I'll treat it specially. And I could say, let's take the value plus a space plus a currency. Right? And it turns out this is a little bit better than even using the currency format in this case, because we didn't start with a number, we started with a string. So I'd argue that this is one of those cases where it's maybe better not to use the number format. Does that make sense? Just because we started with a string rather than because we started with a number. What about euro? Could I handle euro this way and get it to show up as my 321 euro or whatever? Right? Right now this would go in euro, it would go over here and we put in EUR. But if I wanted to put in the euro symbol, I could just add another if to this. And I'd just say, oh, well, we commonly have, Canadian dollars or whatever, or euro in our user base. So I might say, hey, if it's EUR, then we'll add the euro symbol in front. And that way it's still represented here in whatever the currency was originally. We're just using the particular format. I could do the same thing and add yen. And say, hey, so yen is the yen symbol. Does that make sense, everybody? Kind of easier in some sense because we're starting with a string. So in working with how I want you to deal with the currencies from, or the prices from eBay, that's how I would want you to deal with them. They've kind of almost made the job easier for us because they've already formatted the price. So all we've got to determine is how are we going to tack the currency symbol onto it. We don't have to worry about how to format the price itself. They've kind of done half of the problem for us. So that's how I would solve the issue in terms of working with eBay. So it'd be number format. This would be just if statements. So it's very, one of the things to recognize when you're working with numbers and formatting numbers, it's very contextual. It really depends on what your context is, right? What are you trying to format? What is it already starting out as? Is it already starting as an integer or a floating point number or a string? Is it a currency or is it just any kind of regular number? That may change the kind of approach or tactic that you take. So going back to my notes, the next thing on my list would be to then talk about where's that one out? Would be to talk about date format, and I'm going to talk a little bit about server responses as well. So number format's great if you're working with numbers. Although currencies, you sometimes have to do some special things because currency conversions. One thing to recognize, I think when I asked you, one thing I want to point out too, remember we did the whole receipt project thing that we did as a hands-on test? Okay. Well, in that case, the user's inputting prices. What currency is the user inputting prices in? For us, it'd be US dollars, right? What if you've got a user that is in Germany that's using that receipt tag? What currency are they putting their currencies in? They're not going to be putting them in dollars. They're going to be putting them in euros, right? So in that case where the user's inputting prices and they're working with their local data and it's always in the same currency, then this is really good, right? Then this currency format is strongly the thing I would recommend if the unit amounts are coming from the user versus if they're coming from the server, it might be a different story. Does that make sense? So it does depend a little bit if it's user entered data versus if it's database or from other services. So from the date format class, looking at the overview, again, this is a place where looking at the overview tells you a lot. You'll notice that date format provides some styles here. So we've got like full, long, medium, and short. The good news with this is a lot of times when you're working with dates, there's some pretty standardized formats to how to put them out. So like May 14th, 2022 or 14th of May, 2022. There's usually some standardized formats that you want to pick from. They're already there, okay? And so if you're doing one of those, you can use this very simply to get those type of formats, okay? Now, kind of like how the number format's set up, there's a few getters. So I can get a date instance, which would be just for formatting a date. I can get a time instance, which is just for formatting times, or I can get a date time instance, which formats both. Does that make sense? So if I'm working with this and trying to format dates, it might look a little bit like this. I'd start kind of the same way I did with the number format and start by getting my different formats that I might want. And so I might say date format, and this would be date format is date format dot get date instance. And do this 3 times. So date, time, and date time. So this one's get date, get time, and get date time. Right? So I can get different formatters depending on what my goal is. You might notice, like for instance, if we look at this get date time instance, notice that this one actually takes 3 arguments. And so typically I want to pass some arguments. In this case, it's taking a date style, a time style, and a locale. So everybody see that? So I can specify when I'm getting one of these, I could say, hey, I want this in the US locale, or I could specify that I want it in the user's locale. Okay? Either of those is possible. I can pick from some of the different styles that are available there, as well as for date and times. So if I look at here, there's actually some examples. This is for dates. Is there one for time or times? Yeah, that's for times. So they have an example here. So this one depends on locale. So for instance, short might look something like this. For the date, it might look like 12/13/52. That'd be more of a European format, you see with the dots in between, versus we're usually using dashes or slashes. Or 3:30 p.m. would be more of our local sort of thing. It's also worth mentioning in Europe, they oftentimes will use a 24-hour clock, so this will deal with that as well. So we can specify, how do we want these things. So I might say, okay, for a date, maybe I want, I'd say, hey, my date instance could be date format dot long or short, whichever I choose. This might be, I could say, hey, let's ask for the short format here, and when I ask for this one, I might say, hey, let's give me the short and the short. You can kind of play around with it to get to whatever format that looks like you want it to be. But the good news is this works for all of the different locales. If I'm trying to specify the particular locale, I might do locale equals locale dot get default. And so oftentimes when I'm doing anything like this, where it's different string formats and different things that might require locale, I might ask for the locale ahead of time and then just pass that into all of these as just an extra argument. And I would do that with some of the other examples as well. Even with using these formats as well, I might want to grab the locale once and then reuse it. So let's say I've got those different formats. So now I can say date now is new date. If I want to format those things, so now I could get string D is take the date format dot format now. That would get it outputted as a date. If I want the current time, I could use my time format. If I want both, then I would use my other format. That would give me DT. So it's worth noting that again, you use strings also with the number format. Both this way, using this date format and giving the number format, will end up producing a string. So oftentimes when I'm feeding this into the string resources, I'll often feed it in as a %s rather than using like a %d or %f and a %t. Rather than using those percentages, I'll usually use these formatters instead, because it handles a lot of those translation issues for me. Does that make sense? Oftentimes it's just another step, right? You say, hey, let's format the numbers and the times, and then we'll drop it into the format string, into the string resource as a string. All right. So let's go ahead and take a pause. Let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about the last discussion that we want to have.